Thank you so much. Dr. Il Sagong is a longtime mentor. When I first came to Korea in 1997, and with all the roles that you played, both in government and outside of government, but always as a thought leader. So it's a pleasure to be here. I wished I was here in the morning. It sounds like some amazing discussions that you had and speeches, but hopefully I'll be able to pick them up. What I wanted to do for the next 25 or 30 minutes is just take you through our views on the fourth industrial revolution. I think actually Klaus Schwab is the person who defined, and I think in a way that we could all understand where it is. I'm going to refer to that. But just to talk a bit, just from our perspective of what it is and what the opportunities might be. And I'm very excited to be doing it in Korea because I think this country is a country that I think can really, really use this as a growth curve and take advantage from it, more so than pretty well any other country that's out there. Obviously, the United States is doing a lot. Germany is doing a lot, but South Korea has all of the key ingredients and more to really thrive through these particular times. So let me try and work the slides up here. As you know, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, I think you probably talked about it in the morning, when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, I think this, all I would say, instead of going back into the past, is that I think this one will dwarf all the other ones that we've seen because of the speed with which it's happening and the scale with which it's happening. And I think that very, very few of us, including ourselves at McKinsey, are prepared for the transformation that's actually going to be occurring and is underway. As I mentioned, the book that Klaus Schwab put out, I think, is a worthwhile one to look at. I'm not going to go through the different pieces, but he emphasizes the sort of the combination of speed and scale and what that will do and how we all of us need to be prepared, including in particular policy makers. So what I wanted to do is just focus on three things. What are some of the drivers? Because it's difficult to be able to predict what this will look like, but if you have a good sense of the drivers, you'll be able to do a better job of understanding what its implications are. So I want to spend a bit of time on the drivers. Secondly, implications for business, and there are profound implications even today, but let alone over the next 5 or 10 years. And then implications for policymakers. As I said, I think the policymakers are going to have some of the biggest challenges in dealing with the implications of what Industry 4.0 is going to mean. In sort of my own simple mind, there are really three drivers of this. One is computing power. Just the scale of and power of computing power is reaching such a state that we can do more than we've ever been able to do. I was thinking again, the average washing machine, a Samsung or LG washing machine, has more computing power in it today than NASA had to send a man to the moon in 1969, and that just continues to scale and get more sophisticated. The connectedness of the world, both machines and humans, is hit an unprecedented and a critical mass scale. And then it's the data, just the huge amount of data that we are collecting and what we can do with it. And it's the combination of those three things that we think are really driving this. And if you, I'm going to spend a tiny bit on each one. On the connected devices, we're already well past the point where we have more devices than humans that are connected. There's predictions that go out to having 50 billion connected devices by 2025. I'll bet you we've underestimated that as we look at it. We tend to underestimate the scale and prevalence of these things. And we're seeing a very significant drop in sensor costs. When we talk about a sensor, there's many, many different types of sensors, whether it be oscillators or gyroscopes and so forth. So the cost of being able to put sensors on things has significantly dropped. You may not know it as an anecdote, but in a Formula One racing car, it typically has 1,800 sensors on it. I know this because we bought a firm that provided the data analytics for them. And it sort of 2 gigabytes of data comes off a Formula One car on every lap. And so there's a driver that clearly has an important role to play in the car, but there's actually a lot more going on behind the scenes in making that car perform. And what's even more important is that data and data analytics is actually used in innovation with the vehicle in the short cycle time. And those car companies that are able to leverage that gain, and they win Formula One and where it is. So this is prevalent for us to be thinking about. The other notion is, while sensor costs have declined, so has the cloud, and you just see 1,000 times less today than it was in 2010. And this has had a very profound shift on how the world is working. So just the scale, the rapid cost reduction, and the power moving is something that is changing the world. And the Internet of Things basically allows one to capture data and use it to fundamentally improve the performance of whatever it is that data is being used for, whether it be preventative maintenance, whether it being able to find mining sites more effectively, thinking about how to disperse medicine in the most effective way. On every single element of what we do, the Internet of Things is having an effect. This is not new, and I'm going to come back to this in artificial intelligence. It's been around. I think, again, it's the speed and scale with which things are moving. I'm not, for the sake of time, going to go into the examples. You could teach me much more than I could on it. But I think what, at least I find most interesting, is how it's affecting a lot of traditional industries. Ag food, which I believe is going to become one of the most important industries over the next 10 to 15 years. We have to, feed the equivalent of the number of people in terms of the amount of food volume, what we did for the last 10,000 years over the next 40 years in absolute terms. So ag food is going to be incredibly important, and the technology that is being applied to ag food today is significant, but it's going to grow. And so John Deere, they're not a machinery company. They're a software company in terms of what they do. And their critical thing is capturing the data to be able to improve the performance of what yields on crops, the effectiveness of the resource use, and so forth. So ag food is being transformed by the Internet of Things. And this is an area where, again, a country like Korea can be playing a very significant role, even though we may not have the land or the water or the climate to be able to do it. Having the technology is going to be an incredibly important part of this industry value chain and its opportunities. We're not using very much of the immense amount of data that we're capturing. This is just to illustrate on a offshore oil rig. We actually capture a significant amount of data, but less than 1% of it's used for any insight as we go through it. Sometimes because of the poor infrastructure, sometimes because of the weak data management capability, sometimes because there aren't the analytical capabilities. And then people, even if they do the analytics capabilities, don't know how to translate that to the business side of things. And so we're not leveraging the data that we do have. The data that we do leverage actually gives us a lot of insight. And again, if you just think about what we can do with that to improve performance, there's going to be a lot of benefit. Interoperability is absolutely critical to be able to make the Industry 4.0 or Internet of Things to be able to work, because you have to be able to have devices, humans, data, analytics all talking together. One of the challenges is a lot of the innovation is being done in silos. It's being done in a particular device, not thinking about how it actually fits in with the ecosystem of all the different players that are there. So the notion of open platforms, of sharing a common approach for how you're going to be able to build this will be critical. So what this means for organizations is partnering is going to be critically important. For us at McKinsey, for example, who are way too introverted, wanting to do everything ourselves, the game's over on that front. You have to partner and work with other organizations to be able to deliver the value that you need. There is no way that one institution can provide all of the different pieces. And again, I think we're not being very creative actually on this chart in terms of how it's going to evolve. All I would just say is that, you know, a lot of the future is actually here now. Some of it, and I'm going to come to this on the policy side, is being restricted by regulation. I think one of the biggest challenges to IoT or the fourth industrial revolution affecting healthcare is because of regulation. And I think that those countries or cities that are able to figure out how to get the regulation right to allow innovation, allow people to use the data that's being captured on humans, you're going to see more innovation. So I think regulation actually is one of the biggest bottlenecks to innovation in this area. And we're seeing it in fintech, right, and what's happening. Those countries where there are very restrictive rules around what who can play in the financial services industry, it will restrict the innovation that's going on. If you've got Singapore today, they've actually they've called it sandboxes for the fintech companies to allow them to be able to operate in slightly different ways. And I think in Korea that's going to be important. Regulators need to be more open-minded about allowing for unusual types of capabilities to be able to come into the market. In terms of trying to size what this could mean for what if we think about the size of of what this could mean for the global economy, and we just tried to estimate it, we look at what it means for factories, cities, retail environments. Cities and industry overall, but particularly cities are going to be a very important beneficiary of what the Internet of Things do. The number of businesses and startups and enterprises that are going to be built around cities, I think, is going to be, I think we can't imagine what they are. It's going to be very, very significant. I think there will also be this notion, too, of having the ecosystem as opposed to just the devices, because you have to have all three. You need the computing power, you need to have the sensors, and you need to have the data, and they all have to work together. And I think this is where organizations are going to have to move out of their silos to work with others to be able to provide all of the capabilities that are going to be needed. So that's just a bit of background on some of the drivers. We're in the early stages. I think Larry Summers calls it, we're in chapter 1 of a 100-chapter book on this. So if we think it's a big change now, we ain't seen nothing yet. And I think that's just sort of the scale that we need to be thinking about. So in terms of business, there are really three things that we think will be affected by IoT. One is just business model transformation. The second is how we do product innovation. And the third is around organization design. And one thing I will say is that in the 30 years I've been in McKinsey, it's the last 18 months I have never seen so many fundamental business model transformations that are occurring. The absolute number that I've seen in the last 18 months is about 10 times more that I'd seen in the 28 years before holistically. That included restructurings and turnarounds. It is just, and I would argue actually that the more successful you are as a business, you better start thinking very hard about your business model design, because you may be complacent. You may think you've got it all, and you don't. And I look in the mirror, by the way, when I say that. So I think this business model transformation is very, very significant as we look out. I think we're seeing much more on the business model side of people focusing on outcomes. What is the problem you're really trying to solve versus your input into an actual system? And we've seen this with Rolls-Royce or GE with how they're using the information, whether it's jet engines or locomotives. It's the information they're using. One example I often like to give is the one that actually got Jeff Immelt to be a believer in this stuff. And the example is, when you look at locomotives, the average speed of a locomotive is about 22 miles an hour per day. And you might say, well, who cares? That's it. But if you're making locomotives, you're a railway company, that matters a lot. And if you can increase the speed of a locomotive by 1 mile an hour over the course of a day, over the course of the year, the impact of that on profitability for a regular-sized North American railway is roughly $250 million. That's the value. And so what Jeff Immelt got concerned about was we spend all this money, R&D, on the power systems, the input, output, the metal that's being used in the wheels on a beautifully productive, sustainable locomotive. And what we're worried about, though, is some Uber-like group coming in and saying, that's great, keep doing that. We're going to figure out how to manage that locomotive better to increase its average speed, and we'll capture that share of the $250 million improvement. And that's when there's this notion of we have to be a software company, not a device or hardware company in where it is. I'm just going to skip through some of these. Clearly, this is where I go into on the industrial side, what we're seeing right now being applied on preventative maintenance is very significant. If you're in the mining industry, the value that you get from the Internet of Things as it relates to just ensuring that machinery keeps operating and you minimize the downtime is very significant. It's a very significant driver in your EBITDA. And we find it in many different industries. In fact, I'd argue all as we look ahead. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, we think, is going to allow you to do more, to allow basically a computer to look at all sorts of different variations before you actually even try and produce something, we think is going to be able to scale up the innovation that's required. Last week I was in Vancouver looking at D-Wave. I don't know if people have heard of D-Wave. They're a quantum computing company. They're the first to actually sell the machines, right? And a quantum computer, when you think about its horsepower and what it can do, will have very significant implications, again, on data manipulation and I think on innovation. It's early days in where that is, but there are serious efforts that are moving on to try and increase the power even further of what a computer can do. And again, I think we're going to have very different views about what owning a product means. I think one of the many things that Tesla has been pushing the innovation very on is just these software updates on the car that you buy. You don't need to take it in. You get a software update like downloading an app. And again, obviously at some point you have to do something with the equipment, but more and more of an automobile is the electronics and the software. So again, changing the paradigm of how we think about this. On the organization side of things, I think there's going to be very significant changes. We don't think that many organizations have gone the whole way there. It's actually very difficult to find full reference cases of organizations that have done it. One that I pay a lot of attention to is Hire in China. They're an organization that basically on their org structure did some pretty remarkable things. Went from a 80,000 person classic pyramid to basically 40 units of 200 people. They completely flattened the organization. And I was like to say, if they aren't a client of McKinsey, if they were, we'd have told them not to do it because it's too crazy, it's too dramatic. But they did. And they're flattening it because what they're able to do through using the technology they have, the Internet of Things, are able to operate in a much flatter, faster, innovative manner. And you see it in the performance results. So I think we're going to need to have some sort of a measure. There's a measure we try and use with our clients, which is a digital quotient, right? How digital are you? Whether you're a ag food company or a mining company or a hospital chain or a university, what's your digital quotient? We think that's a number that we need to look at, and I think boards should be spending time looking at that. And if you can't measure it, you better start to be able to measure it, again, because of the speed with which this is moving. So lots of changes going on the business side of things, and again, I think we're in the early stages of it. The final part, and then I'll be quiet up here, is what it means for policy makers. And I think that there's a range of things. I just wanted to pick on three. One is, I think, making this a priority, that this actually it's important, and we therefore need, as a government, you say that, and then saying, what's the ecosystem that we want to put in place to be able to encourage the invention, the R&D that's going on, but also translating it to commercialization and allowing established businesses to be able to participate in it. And there's some countries, I think, that are pushing this further than others. The regulatory environment, as I mentioned, I think one of the biggest blockers or the things that can destabilize what we're doing on IoT is regulation and how you think about it. And it's very complicated to deal with that, but it's a muscle that policymakers are going to have to develop, because it'll, I think, lead to either a significant opportunity or a lost opportunity. And then I think the third area is what this means for jobs and skills over time. This is, we think, going to have some pretty profound implications. So just quickly going through this, I think Germany has embraced this in a very full way. They're the ones, Industry 4.0, they're the ones in 2011, I think, that actually named it that way. They have a lot of their foreign investment conferences that they hold are around Industry 4.0. The prizes that they put out are around 4.0. And Angela Merkel knows what Industry 4.0 is and how it should work and how to encourage all parts of the ecosystem to do it. It's not just a phrase. It's something that everyone understands is going to be critically important. Singapore is pushing this extremely hard in terms of the experiments that they're doing with the autonomous taxis, thinking about it in public service delivery, but also the innovation hubs and trying to attract the right mix of people from the different parts of the ecosystem to try and do this in Singapore, in where it is, but it'd be a very aggressive push. And I think, as I said at the outset, this is a natural place for South Korea to be an owner. We've got the industry. We've got more scale than Singapore does in being able to do it in terms of the companies and where they are. We've got the IT infrastructure that's, I think, people are jealous, would love to have this sort of the 5G system we have, but also the consumers. And I would say again that the Korean consumer is one of the most sophisticated consumer of technology in the world. That's why a lot of people, even if they don't do business here, like to test new products, as you well know, here. So we have all the ingredients. We have universities, we have the research. It's a matter of, I think, having an ambition around it to be able to push it. There are challenges, of course. Cybersecurity is one. These countries I've named up here are basically, according to the Asia-Pacific Defense Outlook, are 9 times more vulnerable to cyber attack, but precisely because they're more sophisticated on the technology front. And this is going to be an area that we're going to have to look at. There's been some, Lloyd's on the insurance side is trying to estimate what the impact of some of the cyber attacks might be. And what I would just say on this, I think it was a former national security advisor in the U.S. who said there's basically 2 types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. I think it was Eric Holder. And I think that is something that we should just keep in mind as we do this. This is the sense of the most vulnerable IoT security targets. Believe it, there is an Internet of Things Institute. I didn't know that. I'm just looking at the footnote on here. But I think thinking about vulnerability is actually an important part from a regulatory point of view as this gets built out. And the final area is on jobs. Today, about 45% of paid activities could be automated. It doesn't mean the whole job would be taken away. It's the activities in the job. But the fact of the matter is that's today, let alone looking out. And if you're a commercial driver in the U.S., I would be thinking very hard about this because the driverless trucks are already operating in Utah. And I think this is going to have a very significant change on jobs. And I'm not sure our skilling systems are up to speed. In some work we're doing with the Canadian government right now on growth, one of our focus areas is skills innovation. How are we going to ensure the 18.1 million Canadians that are working today are going to be able to have a job in the next 5 to 10 years? And it will not happen by the current education and training system we have in place. Singapore has launched an experiment that I think is very interesting, a skills innovation council where they give to every Singaporean over the age of 25, they get a skills credit of 500 Singapore dollars that's topped up. They have to, you can't sort of do a cooking course or something. You have to learn something that's related to a skill that might help you be employed. But you see people trying to, how are we going to work this? It's going to be a big issue. And if we don't sort it, my view is we'll have the Brexit Donald Trump type thing occurring because we're going to get a lot more winners and losers in this world than we've ever had before. So I'm going to skip through some of these pages. Last one is just on artificial intelligence. This is an area where I think it's the next horizon. It's another area that South Korea can do a lot. In my view, the way I look at artificial intelligence is it's basically a way to lower the cost of prediction. That's when in my simple mind, that semiconductors really lowered the cost of arithmetic, right? And it had profound implications on business. What this one's doing is lowering the cost of prediction. And when you think about it from that lens and what it can do, it is going to have a huge impact, I think, on disruption in a positive way and in a negative way. But I think having that horsepower and capability and being able to build it is something that would be a very good thing to look at. So that's all I wanted to talk about, really. I think we're in chapter 1 of a 100-chapter book. We're going to see, I think, more profound implications from this industrial revolution than we've seen in the other 3 combined. And I think we all just need to be prepared and work together to capture the benefit of it. Thank you very much.